Good news, women of the world! Finally, a straight cis male is here to explain the thing you like to you. Oh yes, thank you. I deserve this. An almost inconceivably huge thank you to my patrons for making what I do possible, especially the big three, April Mack, Shelby Holtz, and beloved Sulfine. Hello my beautiful watchers, I am Dominic Noble and this is Lost in Adaptation, a show about comparing films to the books they're based on. So, Bridgerton. I've been putting this one off for a while because it's a bit more complicated than what I usually tackle. You see, it's not inaccurate to say that Season 1 of the Netflix show Bridgerton is based on the first novel of the book series by Julia Quinn, but it is wildly insufficient. The TV show isn't just an adaptation of The Duke and I, it gives special attention to the plot of The Duke and I, but in essence it's adapting the entire Bridgerton series with a hindsight the author couldn't possibly have had while she was writing it. You see, the books are pretty laser focused on their two protagonists and their romance, so while there's technically a whole cast of side characters in each one, they only ever feature when they're directly contributing to the lead story in some way. By reading all the books, you're left with the impression it's an ensemble, but each individual entry is decidedly not. The TV show is 100% an ensemble affair right from the start. It spends so much time developing characters that didn't have much to do outside of their own books and setting up plot points that won't pay off until the sequel seasons. To fully understand and break down how this series was adapted, any critic of integrity would have to read all of the Bridgerton novels.
I know what I have to do, but I don't know if I have the strength to do it.
If you'll excuse me, my beautiful watchers. Right. Now we can get started. Julia Quinn is an American author who specializes in historical romances. She claims that, as a young lass, she randomly decided to become a doctor and wrote as a hobby while working towards meeting the academic requirements to get into medical school. However, her novels met with so much unexpected success, she ended up dropping out of medical school in order to pursue writing full-time. The Bridgerton series is a collection of 8 books that she wrote between the years 2000 and 2006. The titular Bridgertons are a large aristocratic English family from the early 19th century, and each book describes one of the Bridgerton siblings meeting, romancing, and marrying the love of their lives. While they're clearly heavily influenced by famous books that were actually contemporary to the era or thereabouts, they put an extremely modern and somewhat American spin on the formula. The characters speak in semi-historically accurate cadences like half the time, and while they slip into modern terminology in the other half, it's never so overt as to make it immediately obvious it's a parody, like something like Hamilton, for example.
Sit down, John, you fat mother!
It was actually a little frustrating for me because I went into reading these books almost completely blind, and I couldn't decide at first if they were intentionally anachronistic or if Quinn just didn't know how to write period pieces convincingly. If you'd like to watch me trying to figure this out in real time and hear my thoughts on each of the book in the series as I read them, I documented my book marathon, and the end result is available on my Patreon page for all pledge levels. In addition to all this modern speak, the books also sported a decidedly modern feminist overtone. I specify modern because I've always maintained that Jane Austen's books, for example, are feminist as fuck, just in a way that makes sense for the era. Lizzie Bennet never threw a punch, but she sure as fuck didn't take no shit from nobody, and I will fight anyone who claims otherwise or points out my double negative. As for my feelings on the series as a whole, okay, just keep in mind that I don't expect nor want my opinion to affect anyone else's, and I would encourage anyone who haven't read them to remember that I am not the target audience when I say that I found the Bridgerton novels to be decidedly, inescapably, unrelentingly average. They're just pretty basic as far as I'm concerned. Some chapters entertained me, but most bored me. Quinn has some really good ideas, but her descriptive writing is repetitive. She over-explains things just a bit too much. She uses the same formula over and over again, and she relies way too heavily on tropes and cliches. Charlotte Bronte once said about Jane Austen's work, "Why the fuck do all of these books only give a shit about the perfect little polished world of the uber-rich and their stupid dramas?" I'm paraphrasing slightly. What she actually said involved words like daguerreotype, physiognomy, and Bonnie Beck, but I'm given to understand that was the sentiment. The same thing occurs here somewhat. In the current political climate, the rich are looking more appetizing by the minute, and I'm less inclined to feel bad for the hurt romantic feelings of the 1% of the 1%. The Bridgerton novels are basically Pride and Prejudice and sex, and once the novelty of that wore off, I felt like I was reading the same just okay book over and over again. But Quinn was at one point the youngest author to be inducted into the Romance Writers of America Hall of Fame. Her books never fail to see the New York Times bestsellers list, and she has a list of other awards as long as one of her male protagonists' penises. And all I have is a bronze medal I won in a fencing competition when I was a teenager. So yeah, I have zero desire to shame anyone for liking her work. It is pretty funny though how quickly the conflict in every single one of her books would have been resolved if the male leads had just had access to mental wellness professionals. Right, now that I have what I am very confident in describing as a comprehensive feel for the books under my belt, I can finally talk about the TV show. Legend has it, Shonda Rhimes, acclaimed television producer and screenwriter famous for Grey's Anatomy, Scandal, and How to Get Away with Murder, ran out of books to read while on vacation and randomly picked up the Bridgerton novels out of boredom. She evidently enjoyed them so much she contacted the surprised and excited Quinn about buying the adaptation rights for her production company, Shondaland, and in July 2018, Netflix announced that they would be teaming up to produce and stream the first season of the show. The task of actually bringing The Tom to life was handed to Chris Van Dusen, who'd worked on most of Shondaland's greatest hits. Phoebe Dynevor was cast as Daphne Bridgerton, the first of the Bridgerton children to find love in the novel series. To my personal everlasting resentment, Regé-Jean Page was cast as her co-star and love interest Simon Bassett. What the fuck were they thinking putting that man into that role? Sir. I feel honor bound to ask you, by what right do you dare to be that beautiful? Did you stop and think for 1 second about how looking that goddamn gorgeous would make every other man on the planet look like we're something deposited into a McDonald's toilet? Damn you, sir. Damn you and your perfect face and abs straight to hell. Jonathan Bailey got the role of Anthony Bridgerton, and Ruth Gemmell his mother, Violet Bridgerton. They were joined by a supporting cast including, but not limited to, Jola Ando, Polly Walker, Ben Miller, Ruby Barker, Nicola Carglin, Claudia Jesse, Luke Newton, Luke Thompson, Martins Imhombe, and Julie Andrews in a voiceover role. Bridgerton Season 1 hit Netflix on Christmas Day 2020 and is considered to be one of the streaming service's biggest successes. Its liberal take on what can often be quite a conservative genre, and female gaze-orientated sex scenes brought in a massive fan base, and it certainly didn't hurt that everyone was desperate for something raunchy to distract them from the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic that had kept them isolated inside their houses for the better part of a year. Because of the before-mentioned atypical nature of this adaptation, I'm only going to talk about what they changed specifically regarding the book's plot, then I'll cover everything that's a show original, and I'll try to break down what has some basis in later books and what's been pulled completely out of Netflix's arse. Before we sally forth, please take note of this spoiler warning for the show, or the books, and later seasons of the show if they stick to the books. And trigger warnings for discussion of non-consensual sexual acts and suicide. These are romantic books, but they can get pretty heavy sometimes. Let's talk adaptation. Like the book, the show's story starts in the year of our Lord 1813. The Bridgerton dynasty itself is dead on, being a closer and more openly affectionate family than the average aristocrats, and consisting of the widow Violet, her son the Viscount Anthony, and his 7 siblings, Benedict, Colin, Daphne, Eloise, Francesca, Gregory, and Hyacinth. As you can see, the alphabetical naming convention is a book accuracy too. Daphne, the eldest daughter, is being prepped to take part in the yearly tradition of all all of the landed gentry from all over Britain coming to stay at their London properties so they can mingle their of-age children in the hopes of instigating marriages. Meanwhile, an old school friend of Anthony's, Simon Arthur Henry Fitzrandolph Bassett, the Duke of Hastings, newly returned from globetrotting after his father's death, is discovering he's the most eligible catch of the event, so increasingly overwhelmed with a horde of genteel young ladies and their matchmaking mothers. This is particularly distressing for him as he's determined to never marry or have children because his abusive father, who had for all intents and purposes disowned him for the terrible crime of having had a childhood speech impediment, was obsessed with keeping the dukedom within their genetic line, so ending it had become Simon's way of getting posthumous revenge. However, he just can't bring himself to refuse when Lady Danbury, a woman who'd been kind to him during his miserable childhood, demands that he attend a ball that she's throwing, during which he happens to witness Daphne giving a suitor who wouldn't take no for an answer an impressive right hook. Despite being initially at odds with each other, when Daphne laments to him that she's gained no interest from any young men she might actually like, Simon proposes a sneaky ruse that would benefit them both. They would pretend to be courting one another, making the respectful mothers of potential brides back off from him, and trick all of the eligible bachelors into re-evaluating her out of jealousy. Then they could fake break up, and she could have her pick of the bunch. A sizable hitch in the plan is her three elder brothers' protectiveness. Anthony in particular, because he can't help but see his old friend as the complete fuckboy he used to be. But despite his objections, the plan goes ahead and appears to be a success. Too much so, in fact, as they enjoy each other's company so much, they start to catch the real feels. Over a late-night glass of room-temperature milk, neither their pampered asses could figure out how to use a stove, Daphne asks Anthony why Simon is so anti-marriage and is warned in no uncertain terms that he is bad news. She, of course, ignores this advice and the romance between them intensifies. While it's not enough for Simon to overcome his childhood trauma, it is enough that they just can't resist going to second base in the gardens during yet another fancy party. They're aggressively cock-blocked by an enraged Anthony, who, after Simon maintains his refusal to marry, demands satisfaction and arranges to meet Simon for a quite illegal duel the next morning at dawn. Daphne manages to talk Colin, the most level-headed of her bros, into telling her where the duel is due to take place and races there just in time to prevent it by informing Simon that they were seen sneaking off into the bushes together, so even if he lets Anthony kill him, her reputation would still be irreparably tarnished if he doesn't marry her. He explains that he cannot have children, expecting this to put her off the idea, but nevertheless, she persists. Good lord, I was almost just killed by a word. The night before their wedding, Violet gives her daughter the talk, though is so embarrassed by the whole thing, she manages to be entirely unenlightening on the subject of sex and procreation. The somewhat happy couple spend their wedding night at a nice inn, and despite a hesitant start, get their consummation on and then some. Simon's pull-out game is strong and remains so for the next few months. Naive of the significance of this action, Daphne starts to enjoy married life and learns valuable insight into her husband from their housekeeper, who spills the tea on his less than ideal upbringing. Eventually, though, she puts two and two together regarding Simon's insistence on Jackson Pollocking the sheets every night. This brings us to the controversial moment where she, shall we say, takes matters into her own hands. We'll have to swing back to this again later because while the core issue, namely that of her non-consensually attempting to thrust fatherhood upon Simon, is the same in both versions, it still goes down slightly differently in the book. Shocked by her actions, Simon briefly loses his iron-hard control over his speech impediment, which brings back all of his childhood trauma and widens the new emotional chasm between them. Daphne initially believes she was successful in her quest to become pregnant, but it turns out she was just a little late on her period. Fortunately, they eventually talk things out, and Simon realizes that denying himself the joys of fatherhood for no other reason than to spite a ghost was only punishing himself, and they go forth and multiply, living happily ever after. Punctuating the narrative are excerpts from what has to be the world's first tabloid newspaper, a publication by an anonymous woman using the pen name Lady Whistledown. Having the wonderful Julie Andrews narrate these articles was a clever way of maintaining the character's secret identity and is accurate to the way that Penelope used the cadence of an older woman in her writing to throw people off her trail. It's also true to the book that she cunningly handed out her paper for free at first, then when all of the ton became addicted to the drama, she started charging for for it. And hear me out, I personally think the Regency core orchestral covers of the modern pop songs that made up the soundtrack, while not always bangers, were pretty damn in keeping with the anachronistic vibe of the book. The first change that I noticed about the TV show was how different the perception of Simon is during his introduction. Despite the series following and being named after the Bridgerton family, the first chapter is solely focused on Simon's birth and childhood. During this intro, it is made abundantly clear just how insincere his aloof, unfriendly facade is long before he meets Daphne. It kind of reminds me of the in-universe perception of Percy Jackson, where everyone thinks he's a total badass, but the reader knows that he was screaming inside his head every time he did something remotely cool. It's actually very funny just how much Simon lucked into doing all of these things that created this rakish persona. Being a man of few words, his slow, deliberate speech, and his refusal to rise to anyone's bait was in reality simply him being too terrified to speak in public, but it was interpreted as him being the tall, dark, silent type with a superior demeanor.
Ah, Mr. Bassett, just the man I wanted to talk to. Now,
Blast, don't stutter. Okay, don't stutter, Simon. Simon, don't stutter. For the love of God, do not stutter when you respond to this idiot. Don't stutter, 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 don't stutter.
Don't you think? No.
Because we're not privy to all of this internal insecurity, and because we don't learn about his backstory until episode 2, the show's audience is never made quite as aware of how disingenuous this persona is. Book Daphne saw right through it, by the way. There's a funny moment during their first meeting where Simon tries to turn the scary, angry, horny Duke facade on full blast to intimidate her, and she just laughs in his face. I was also a little disappointed they skipped over the part of his backstory where he bluffed his way into Eton, the most prestigious school in Britain. The little dude just rocked up there and convinced them they'd mislaid his paperwork, and by the time his father found out, it was too awkward to withdraw him. Book Simon didn't make his vow to never wed or sire an heir to his father directly, which I think was part of the problem. He stayed out of the country until his dad had snuffed it, so he never got to stand up to him directly, hence why he was constantly trying to stick it to his ghost to the detriment of his own family life. Not long into their marriage, an old man, who turned out to be another duke and an old friend of Simon's father, tries to give Simon a bunch of letters his dad wrote for him before he died. Simon orders them burned, but Daphne hangs on to them just in case. At the end of the book, Simon chooses not to destroy them, but decides not to read them yet. A surprisingly mentally healthy compromise. You know, I genuinely feel a little bad for poor Nigel Burbrook, considering how badly Netflix besmirched him. He's described in later novels as not having a single malicious bone in his body, even if he's as dumb as a plank of wood and about as interesting. He does accidentally blunder into Daphne during his proposal because he drank an entire bottle of whiskey to work up the courage, and he got his deserved beatdown from both Daphne and Simon, but after sobering up, he takes the hint, and that's the last we see of him. I guess they felt like the show needed a villain, however, so the on-screen version of him is a damn sight more butthurt about his rejection, a lot more intentional in his initial assault, and continues his ham-fisted courtship for an entire episode of the season after being told nah. This somehow ends up including goading Simon into a fight that he promptly loses and attempting to blackmail the entire Bridgerton family into acquiescing to the union. This sub-arc reflects rather badly on show Anthony too. Book Ant-Man 100% supported Daphne being allowed to reject any man she wished, but Sideburns McGee here agrees to Nigel's proposal without consulting his sister and attempts to force her into it when she refuses, only relenting when Simon snitches on him about why Nigel has a shiner. A silver lining to this character assassination was the opportunity it gave Violet to shine, as she cunningly uses her servants to information gather Nigel's misdeeds and then weaponizes Lady Whistledown's paper to expose him and drive him out of London. One of what I believe to be Quinn's personal favourite fetishes was omitted from this season of the show. I kid you not, I lost track of how many of these books included a scene in which a man sensually removes a glove from a woman's hand. It's like a whole page of description every time, a whole page of slow glove removal in like every other book. You know, I've tried to make it clear that I understand that these books were written with the female gaze in mind, but it's just... Is that really a thing for y'all? Huh. Hey babe, can we try an experiment?
doing anything for you?
I am now a Bridgerton fan.
Okay. We did it, folks!
Book Simon and Daphne, quite wisely in my opinion, let Anthony in on the plan almost immediately so he'd stop getting all up in their grills about it. He doesn't, but, you know, it's less. I don't know why the show versions of them didn't follow suit. One of the biggest distractions from the book's plot was the love triangle that formed between Duke Gorgeous, the Daphnator, and Prince Friedrich of Russia. I'm sorry to inform you there weren't any cinnamon roll German royals in the book. But because he bows out of the story so gracefully when Daphne makes her choice, he only slows down the plot rather than significantly derailing it. The show also does some wheel spinning when Daphne gets down with some duchessing in Hastings and tries to make all the poor people happy. No one can deny that the books are unapologetically sexual, so it's not super out of place, but the scene where Simon gives Daphne some dukish advice is a show original. You know, the part where he tells her she can flick the bean if she wants. Janing off is within her power. Polishing the pearl is a feasible option. If the mood takes her, she can diddle the skiddle. She could click the mouse when she's alone in her house. He explains to her how to The show implies that Daphne's unpopularity with potential gentlemen's suitors was primarily due to Anthony scaring them all off, and while that was almost certainly a factor in the book, Daphne herself was convinced it was more the fault of her being in the friend zone with every noble in London. She was perceived as being a great person to be bros with, but not a potential love interest. It's an easy to identify character trait because Quinn would go on to use it for every single one of her female love interests for 8 books. Alright, I guess it's time to revisit that scene. As mentioned, there are some key differences between the book and the show in regards to the way that Daphne attempted to force Simon to impregnate her against his obvious wishes. Unfortunately, neither version handles this touchy subject particularly well. Making matters worse in the novel, Simon was very, very drunk during the event, and Daphne initiated sex with him while he was asleep. For context, she'd confronted him about the difference between not being able to have children and not being willing to have children a few days before, and refused to have sex with him ever since. After trying his utmost but still failing to bully, shout and manipulate her into dropping the issue, Simon went out and got absolutely plastered before stumbling home and making an inebriated attempt to get Daphne to talk to him. She had grudgingly allowed him to sleep in her bed, and after he passed out, she noticed he'd come to attention despite being unconscious. It's made abundantly clear in the book that she has complete control over him and is getting off on the power trip. For his part, Book Simon would go on to retroactively question exactly how non-consensual the event was, as he remembers being extremely enthusiastic to have sex and doesn't remember making enough of an effort to stop himself from breaking his no cream pie diet. Obviously, being as drunk as he was, his consent is fairly moot, but that's the way he saw it. He was actually way more upset about having slipped back into his childhood stammer afterwards than he was about the violation of his bodily autonomy. In the show, Simon is sober and awake, but Daphne doesn't reveal that she's figured out how reproduction works until after the deed is done. What makes it especially problematic here is the immorality of Daphne's actions is never addressed in the show, as the aftermath conversation is all about Simon's half-truth about being able to have children, implying that that was the greater crime, or at least that it justified Daphne's actions. Just taking a moment to cite my sources, I humbly beg you to watch the video the incredibly talented Princess Weeks did on this subject. I'll link to it again at the end of the video. For what it's worth, and I am not saying that this excuses what Daphne did, but I just don't see how she could possibly have understood the gravity of her misdeed. I mean, it's a major plot point that no one sufficiently explained sex to her, and yet we all appear to expect her to have a comprehensive understanding of the importance of consent in relation to it. The only thing a woman in her era is ever told about bodily autonomy is that she does not have it. So yeah, I'm not saying that what she did was okay, I'm really not. I'm just saying that her failure to recognize it was basically inevitable. So yeah, both versions of the scene are not great, and I don't think either version of the story benefits from it, especially considering Daphne's scheme fails anyway. I am certain there was a better third act breakup scenario they could have gone with. Originally, Simon buggers off to stay at another one of his properties the very next day, and they don't see each other again until the end of the book, but because everything's gotta be super stretched out in the show, they continue to awkwardly do aristocrat stuff together for another 2 episodes before they figure their shit out. In the book, when Simon arrives back in London, determined to make things right, Daphne is out on a horse ride to clear her head after finding out she's not with child. She misinterprets the sound of Simon's approach as a bandit attack or something like that, and rides right into a tree branch, throwing her to the ground. There's a whole thing where Simon's equally concerned and mad at her, but he's also upset about the child he thought he didn't want in the first place. You get the idea. Lady Danbury only makes one very small appearance in this particular book, but Joa Ando is such a fucking legend in this, I dare say few will resent her expanded role. I was surprised to say the least to witness the big reveal of Whistledown's true identity at the end of the season, as Quinn had held off on this until the 4th novel, and even then she left it until about halfway through the sodding book, which is kind of nuts considering that Penelope was a POV character. She literally never even thought the words "I'm Whistledown" until Collins stumbled onto her secret. I rather suspect this information being readily available in book form for anyone excessively curious was a factor in this premature revelation. There's not much point trying to hang on to a secret if someone can just Google it. A highlight of the book for me was the Bridgerton family constantly trolling each other in the most disarmingly affectionate way. The show includes some of it, don't get me wrong, but it's just that a few of my personal favourite moments didn't make the cut.
So, did Mother provide you with a list of potential fiancés as well?
Yes, but I forgot it.
Ah, I've got mine. Every time someone tries to talk to me tonight, I'm going to pull up my scrying glass and inspect it before I answer them.
You don't own a scrying glass.
Haha! I bought one especially for this. Oh, come sister, this is comedy gold. Mother, I'm ready to socialise!
Probably the single biggest section of the book that got overlooked by the show was the Bridgerton's family trip to Greenwich that Simon tagged along on. It was actually kind of cute. He nerded out over maritime navigation facts in front of everyone. Young Gregory messed around on the Thames Wharf front, and both Simon and Anthony ended up falling in trying to save him. I'm given to understand this particular wet t-shirt contest might have been reserved for season 2. Okay, before I move on to the many additions to the plot, I guess I should address all the black people. Oh boy, please don't take that out of context. While the colour of people's skin was rarely described in the novel, it is still pretty safe to say that the entire cast was white as fuck. I mean, I could ramble at you a bit about Simon's icy blue eyes and whatnot, but it's quicker just to say that Quinn has confirmed that all of her characters were white as fuck. Ironically, her reasoning for this seems to boil down to it would just be too complicated and time-consuming to justify the existence of non-white people being treated as equals by the 19th century British aristocracy.
Before going on, I would like to once again direct you to an essay made by my good friend Princess on this subject that helped inform this video and contains a lot more insight on this subject.
For my part, like many people who saw so much as a thumbnail relating to this show, I went in assuming that Shondaland and Netflix had chosen to partake in the increasingly popular colorblind casting, in the same way they had run with a time-blind soundtrack, so I was very surprised when they started exposition dumping information explaining black aristocrats' existence in the dialogue.
We were two separate societies, divided by color, until a king fell in love with one of us.
The show was revealed to be taking place in an alternate history where Queen Charlotte, the Prussian-born wife of King George III, was black and had influenced her husband to use his royal power to elevate wealthy black families to the nobility. In fact, Van Dusen straight up rejected the term colorblind casting in regards to his series, stating in an interview with the New York Times that would imply that color and race were never considered when color and race are part of the show. I'm sorry to say that it is my opinion that if Mr. Van Dusen's intention was to adapt the story to take into account that some of the cast are now people of colour, he did not succeed in this endeavour. And I'm not even talking about the writers expecting us to accept that racism in the UK was completely erased because a black woman joined the royal family, because, as we all know, exactly that happened when Meghan Markle married Prince Harry, and they were definitely not chased out of the country and forced to go and live with Oprah or something. No, my issue stems from an adaptation perspective. That is, after all, why I'm here. As far as I can deduce, the original plot of the book was updated to account for some of the lead roles being switched from a race that had enjoyed the most privilege the world had ever seen for generations to an extremely persecuted minority group exactly once. Simon's father was, in the book, a piece of shit to his son because he was filled with delusional, egotistical pride for his ancient lineage. But now he's a piece of shit to his son because he's hyper-aware of how easily the black aristocrats could be stripped of their newfound noble titles if they failed to impress the rest of society.
We have been granted this line. The monarchy itself has declared it. But it will only remain ours so long as we remain extraordinary.
That's it. That is the only example that I could find, and even that's not really accounted for in the plot as a whole, because the rest of the country that's supposedly so ready and eager for the black nobles to slip up appears to be utterly oblivious of this precarious position. For example, Violet Bridgerton, whom the show goes out of its way to paint as a politically and socially savvy mastermind, whose sole purpose in life is to arrange happy, influential, and most of all, secure marriages for her children, never once hesitates to encourage a union with a duke whose title could supposedly be whipped away from him at any moment. So either Van Dusen failed to think the knock-on effects of this plot point through, or Duke Bad Dad is just paranoid over nothing. I don't know, the whole thing's just confusing because the show flaunts its historical inaccuracy in so many other ways, so one has to wonder why Van Dusen decided to die on the it's not colorblind casting hill, and if they made an entire spin-off series just to get a do-over so they can explain it better. I've taken the liberty of giving all the subplots I clocked their own little title to help keep them straight in my mind. Let's start with Anthony and his on-again, off-again opera singer girlfriend. In addition to fulfilling his book role of overprotective big brother and betrayed best friend, Anthony spends most of his free time throughout the season either breaking up with or getting back together with his mistress, an English opera singer by the name of Sienna Rosso. There's a brief cameo from an Italian opera singer that Anthony had bonked in the past in book 2, but his intention to rekindle the connection is almost immediately derailed by his budding romance with the book's other POV character, and she's never mentioned again. Sienna bounces around a few other scenes trying to pick up another sugar daddy, and eventually rejects Anthony for someone more reliable, but has zero meaningful impact on the plot as a whole. Queen Charlotte versus Whistledown. Considering what a large role she plays in the series, those unfamiliar with the books might be surprised to hear that Queen C never featured in any of the 8 Bridgerton books. She is 100% a Shondaland creation. Besides some rather heartbreaking scenes involving her husband the King's deteriorating mental health, she spends most of her time on screen getting annoyed at how she's being reported on by the elusive Lady Whistledown. After the Queen publicly endorses Daphne Bridgerton, Whistledown implies the girl's lack of success in the marriage race reflects poorly on Her Majesty, prompting Charlotte to attempt to tip these scales in her favour by setting her up with her princely nephew, only for this to backfire too when Daff chooses Duke Handsome. In a show of rather poor sportsmanship, she decides to stop playing the games of wit altogether and starts attempting to uncover her nemesis' identity. This quest crosses over with Eloise briefly as she's on a similar mission, though the lass gets discarded after failing to uncover anything useful fast enough. She also has the opportunity to throw a spanner in the works of Simon and Daphne's wedding by not granting them a special dispensation to ignore the very made-up plot-convenient law about a minimum engagement time, forcing Simon to get all real about his feelings while pretending he's just acting. Marina's never-ending pregnancy nightmare. I kind of see this one as even more spoilery than average, so if you'd like to skip it, here's the time code. Just gonna give you a second in case you want to avail yourself of that. Okay. Marina does not appear, nor is she mentioned, until the 5th novel in the Bridgerton series, and she dies in the prologue of that book. After what is implied to be a long period of battling mental health issues, she attempts to drown herself in a lake, is rescued by her husband Sir Philip, but dies anyway a few days later from a fever that she contracted from the cold water. To put it very bluntly, Marina is little more than a small part of the setup for Eloise Bridgerton's unusual romance, as she becomes romantically involved with Sir Philip entirely via letters after his wife's death. To make such a minor character as this a significant part of Season 1 was a bold choice, and I respect it, I really do. It's just, I don't know, it saddens me a little bit that they did it just to punish her over and over again and make her suffer like she's been condemned to a very waspish circle of hell. She's now a distant relative of the Featheringtons instead of the Bridgertons, and she's staying with them because Lord Featherington owes her father money or something, I don't know. Even before the poor girl finds out she's with child out of wedlock, her host Lady Featherington treats her like absolute garbage, then intensifies her awful behaviour when her lack of period outs her, to the point where she fakes a letter from her baby daddy breaking up with her. Marina's then pressured into trying to entrap a wealthy man into believing he's the father. Then when she almost succeeds in this with Colin Bridgerton, it puts her in a love triangle with her only friend Penelope. Then when she's outed, she becomes a social pariah. Then she gets a tiny glimmer of hope when she finds out her boyfriend actually does love her. only for him to have turned out to have just died in the Napoleonic Wars. Then, after a painful, failed holistic abortion attempt, she's forced to marry his brother, whom she doesn't love or even know. It is interesting that said brother, Sir Philip, despite being one of the 16 POV characters of the book series, is given so little attention by the show. That shows an impressive level of patience regarding setting up slow burn plot payoffs. So, I do see the benefits of setting up how he and Marina ended up in a pleasant enough but ultimately loveless marriage, but damn, it sure is a bummer to see this poor girl be a misery sink all the way through the season, you know? Eloise, the feminist. As mentioned, the Bridgerton books are already fairly feminist, importing as much modern sentiments into the early 19th century as Quinn could get away with. I guess Van Dusen felt this was still far too subtle, because Netflix Eloise's entire reason for existing appears to be to complain about the patriarchal nature of society, only ever pausing in this tirade to take a drag on a cheeky ciggy. Book Eloise was a chatterbox and less ashamed than the average person to stick her nose into other people's business, but showed no excessive desire to jumpstart the suffragette movement a century early. She makes it her mission to uncover the true identity of Lady Whistledown because she wishes to emulate her as a female entrepreneur and is enamored by her brief acquaintanceship with Queen Charlotte because she's currently the single most influential woman in the world. The danger of characters like this is they're often treated as the butt of the joke. The feminist points they bring up are entirely undercut by how annoying you're supposed to find them. The show version of Eloise kind of skirts this line without fully crossing it, in my opinion. While no one else seems keen to rush to her cause, and friends like Penelope don't always have time for her when they have boy trouble on their minds, she's never outright treated as a punchline for daring to voice objectively correct complaints about the lack of gender equality. And it was a great relief that the conclusion of her story arc in season 1 wasn't her learning that she'd be a happier person if she stopped complaining and just enjoyed life, or anything else that might be considered a punishment for having a valid argument but going about addressing it the wrong way. In fact, her defining moment is an act of solidarity with another professional woman when she ultimately chooses to protect Lady Whistledown from discovery despite her desperate desire to know the truth herself, unwittingly saving her best friend in the process. I am genuinely fascinated to see how this very different take on the character is going to play out when they get to her story. I mean, one has to assume it's going to require some pretty drastic deviations from the book's plot, but well, I guess we've got to wait and see. Wait, is Benedict gay now? Probably one of the more frustrating additions to the story, as it seems to just fizzle out without any meaningful payoff, at least for now. Again, maybe we'll find out more when Benny Boy gets his own season. Benedict Bridgerton, the sibling who lost the alliteration lottery, spends his allotment of ensemble screen time getting close to a famous painter, who's eventually revealed to be secretly homosexual. Not being a part of the LGBTQ myself, I might be missing some nuances here, but I just don't see where any of this went. Ben's mildly shocked to discover his new friend has a beard, then they just stop hanging out and he starts dating a seamstress with a fake French accent. Perhaps this is the queer baiting I've heard so much about. Lady Featherington and her gambling husband. This is one of the more openly contradictory to the book storylines jammed into the show, partly because Portia Featherington is never more than a comedic relief background character in the novels, and partly because Archibald Featherington died 3 years before the first book. The show grants him a reprieve from this demise in order for him to financially ruin his family by gambling away their entire fortune, attempting to fix the issue by fixing a boxing match, but getting caught and murdered off-screen by some shady bookies. When Lady Featherington isn't busy being a massive tool to Marina, she's figuring out what her husband is up to and dealing with the fallout. Being a fan of HBO's Rome, I could tell that they were planning to do more with Portia the second I saw that they'd cast Molly Walker to play her. You don't bring in Attia of the Julii, the ambitious, amoral, murderous matriarch of the most powerful family in the Empire and the mother of Augustus Caesar, if she's not going to do anything but bustle around trying to introduce her daughters to young bachelors. Right, I would also like to throw out some honourable mentions of the characters that don't really have their own storylines but are still raised in status by the show compared to the books. Will Mondrich, bare-knuckle boxer and close friend of Simon, is an original creation and appears to mostly exist to be a sounding board for the Duke's romantic struggles while they spar with each other bare-chested and sweaty. Book Simon's fighting abilities are due to having learned a lot about self-defense during his travels and not really explored forward any further than that. Will ends up taking a bribe from Lord Featherington to take a dive in his final boxing match, earning him enough money to support his family indefinitely, and fortunately, if surprisingly, is spared from the same retribution his benefactor suffered. Fun fact, the character was inspired by real-life black boxing champion Bill Richmond, a former slave who supposedly ended up as the personal fighting coach for a British baron. The before-mentioned not really French dressmaker, Madame de la Roche, is an interesting character because she makes so many appearances in the show, but doesn't really do all that much. She does get to be a whistle-down red herring at least, so that's nice for her. Cressida, the mandatory mean girl, doesn't actually make an appearance in The Duke and I, though she does pop up in later novels, mostly to be mean to Penelope Featherington. They borrowed a scene from The Viscount Who Loved Me, but swapped Anthony out with Colin to set up his future romance with the young wallflower. Cressida bounces around being generally unpleasant, but her main role in Season 1 appears to be a romantic rival for the attention of Prince Friedrich, whom Daphne ends up rejecting anyway. If I might be so bold, I'd like to show some love for the surprisingly cute romance between Philippa Featherington and her chinless suitor, Mr. Finch, that mostly takes place in the background. The dude brought her flowers even though he's allergic to them. That's kind of adorable. It's another positive side effect of Nigel Burbrook being such a tosser in this show, as he eventually married Philippa in the books after striking out with everyone else. The final show original character of note is none other than Chekhov's bee, who insists on popping up during every other bloody transition. Hello there, you little rascal. It is not your time to shine yet. Go bother Nicolas Cage or something. Final thoughts. So strictly from an adaptation perspective, this one's a little hard to quantify. The original story is in there, but it is absolutely buried under all the things they added to the show. I mean, they did it well. It's a great example of how to turn a pretty focused story into an ensemble, with each sub-arc crossing over with each other and the main romantic plot just enough to give the impression that it's all connected, but when you stop and think about it, everyone's off kind of doing their own thing almost entirely independently. And it was fascinating to see the usual formula flipped on its head, and the adaptation containing so much more than the book, a clear advantage of a series versus a film. The question I usually ask myself to decide these things, would I recommend the series to someone who's a fan of the book and vice versa, is also not very helpful here because there are wildly different answers. If you're someone who liked the books but hasn't given the series a chance yet, well, firstly, according to my research, you are entirely hypothetical, so if there is someone watching this video who matches that description, sound off in the comments so that I can know your story. But anyway, yes, I think you would enjoy the show. Like I said, the book is in there somewhere, and all of the original content is competently written, and only very occasionally sabotages the plots of later books. I mean, I personally found myself getting a little impatient for the Simon-Daphne plot to advance, while everything else started to feel a bit like a distraction, but that is honestly kind of ironic because I was getting really bored of these two when I was reading the book, so you'd think I would be happy to spend time with other characters. So I suspect that was probably just a side effect of the adaptation critic mindset I went in with, so definitely not applicable to general audiences. On the flip side, if you've enjoyed the show and you're considering reading the books, I don't know, it really depends on what part of the show you enjoyed, because if it's anything other than Simon and Daphne's story, it's not in there. Like I said at the start, before and after a bunch of qualifications, I personally feel the books are a little mid, so you're really not missing out if you just watch the show. So I guess it all comes down to a matter of personal philosophy. If you think a good adaptation involves being as close to the book as possible, it's not that. If your heart tells you it's good as long as the books are in there, and it's okay to add to it as much as you like as long as none of it derails the original plot, then it's a resounding success. And if you happen to feel it's an adaptation's duty to improve on the source material if possible, I'd say it's a win there too. So, what came next and what's coming up in Bridgerton's future? Well, they made Season 2 based on the second book, and as of this video's publication, about a week ago, Netflix released the first half of Season 3, which, slightly confusingly, is based on Book 4. To fully explain why would involve breaking down Season 2, so let me know if you'd like me to do that. I'm given to understand that Season 4 has already been commissioned, though we don't know which book they're going to be covering. Like I said, there's a bunch of reasons why I think they skipped over Book 3 for now. I assume a big one, though, is the first half of the book is just an homage, and by that I mean a lazy rip-off of Cinderella, and that might be a little hard to sell in a TV show. And of course there's the before-mentioned spin-off covering Queen Charlotte and King George's early days of marriage. Side note, I personally find it really funny that within 10 years we've had two historically questionable interpretations of King George III, and one sings about killing your friends and family while spewing spittle across a stage, while the other is a gorgeous troubled heartthrob that oozes charm from every orifice. Anyways, in a cute reversal of the previous status quo, Shonda Rhimes and Quinn worked together to write a novelization of the series, though as it involves show original characters, one has to assume it doesn't tie into the other novels. And there's a ton of merch available for the die-hard fans. I am so tempted to buy Bridgerton Clue just to find out if it means what I think it means, and one of the Bridgertons has murdered another. Like, Daphne beat Anthony to death in the library with the candlestick. Well, thank you for putting me on your dance cards tonight, my beautiful watchers. Like I said, I can move straight on to Season 2 if there's enough interest for it, so don't keep your comments to yourselves. Here's the links to the before-mentioned vastly superior videos on this subject, or if you would like to see my take on a more authentic historical romance, I've covered the two most popular adaptations of Pride and Prejudice. Fairly well.